Have you noticed that your electricity bill keeps rising, even though your lifestyle hasn't really changed? You didn't suddenly buy new appliances, you're not running heavy equipment at home, and you're probably even trying to be more careful with your usage. Yet somehow, every few months, the amount you pay keeps creeping up. And the most unsettling part is that it's not just happening to you, it's happening everywhere. Across the United States, across Europe, in parts of Asia, and in countries that used to have relatively stable energy costs. At first, many people thought it was temporary, maybe inflation, maybe fuel prices, maybe just a seasonal adjustment. But the increases didn't stop. In some places, they accelerated. Families who were comfortable a few years ago are now looking at their monthly bills and genuinely wondering what changed. Because it doesn't feel proportional. It feels unpredictable. What most people don't realize is that the real reason power bills are rising worldwide isn't just about fuel or weather. Those are surface explanations. The deeper issue is structural. Energy production has become more centralized, more fragile, and more expensive to maintain. Aging infrastructure, grid instability, geopolitical tensions, renewable transitions, carbon policies, and rising operational costs are all converging at the same time. And when multiple pressure points hit the system simultaneously, the cost doesn't disappear. It gets passed down to households, to you. The problem is that energy isn't optional. You can delay buying a new phone, you can postpone a vacation, but you can't stop using electricity. It powers your fridge, your internet, your heating, your lighting, your entire daily routine. That dependency creates a silent vulnerability. When something becomes essential and centralized, you lose negotiation power. You become a price taker. And that's the invisible pain most homeowners are starting to feel. It's not just about paying a higher bill. It's about realizing you don't control something fundamental in your own home. You're connected to a system that is growing more expensive and less stable, and you don't really have a say in how it's managed. So the real question isn't just, why is my bill higher? The real question is, what happens if this trend continues? And more importantly, what options do ordinary people actually have? Most headlines will tell you that energy prices are rising because of inflation, supply, chain disruptions, or geopolitical conflicts. And yes, those factors do play a role, but they are not the full picture. What rarely gets explained is how the structure of the modern power grid makes price increases almost inevitable over time. The global energy system was built decades ago around centralized production. Massive power plants generate electricity, and it travels through thousands of miles of transmission lines before reaching homes and businesses. That infrastructure requires constant maintenance, upgrades, and security. As equipment ages, costs increase. As demand grows with electric vehicles, data centers, and smart homes, the strain intensifies. And as governments push for rapid transitions toward renewable energy, new systems are layered on top of old ones instead of replacing them cleanly. All of this creates complexity, and complexity is expensive. There is also the issue of grid stability. Renewable energy sources like solar and wind are powerful, but they are intermittent. When the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow, backup systems must activate. Those backup systems often rely on fossil fuels, which are subject to global price volatility. So the system becomes a balancing act, and balancing costs money. That cost doesn't disappear. It gets distributed across consumers. Then there's the financial side. Utility companies operate within regulated frameworks, but they still need to maintain profitability to attract investors and fund expansion. When operating costs rise, rate adjustments follow. In many regions, those adjustments are approved automatically through regulatory processes that most homeowners never even see. What makes this situation different now is that multiple stress factors are happening simultaneously. Aging infrastructure, increasing demand, climate-related events damaging grids, energy policy shifts, and global instability are all stacking on top of each other. It's not one single crisis, it's cumulative pressure. And here's something even more important. Electricity demand is projected to grow significantly over the next decade. Artificial intelligence, electric transportation, home electrification, and digital infrastructure all require more power, not less. That means the grid will need even more investment, more upgrades, more expansion. Again, those costs don't stay in a corporate spreadsheet. They show up on monthly bills. This is why the increases feel persistent instead of temporary. It's not just a spike, it's a structural shift. The uncomfortable reality is that most homeowners are completely dependent on a system that is becoming more expensive and more complex each year. And because it's centralized, you have very little control over pricing, sourcing, or reliability. If rates go up, you pay. If outages increase, you wait. If policies change, you adapt. The system works until it doesn't. And even when it works, it costs more. So the question becomes less about blaming a single cause and more about understanding your position inside that system. Are you simply absorbing every increase as it comes? Or is there another way to think about your relationship with energy at home? Modern homes today are more energy dependent than at any other point in history. Think about how much of your daily routine relies on electricity. Your refrigerator runs 24 hours a day. Your internet modem never turns off. Heating and cooling systems regulate your environment constantly. Many homes now have smart devices, security systems, electric vehicle chargers, and connected appliances that quietly consume power in the background. Electricity is no longer just a utility. It is the backbone of modern life. This growing dependence creates a hidden vulnerability. When energy becomes essential to nearly every function inside your home, any disruption, whether financial or technical, has a magnified impact. A higher bill is not just an inconvenience, it becomes a recurring financial pressure. An outage is not just darkness, it disrupts communication, work, food storage, and sometimes even safety. What makes this more concerning is that the grid was not originally designed for the level of demand we are placing on it today. Decades ago, households consumed far less power. Today, entire neighborhoods can draw the equivalent load of small industrial zones. Add extreme weather events, aging transformers, overloaded substations, and increased electrification policies, and the margin for error narrows. You may have noticed that outages in some areas are becoming more frequent or lasting longer. In other regions, utilities are proactively raising rates to fund infrastructure hardening against climate risks. Again, these changes are framed as necessary investments, and often they are, but the cost lands on the consumer. And here's where the dependency issue becomes more psychological than technical. When you rely entirely on one centralized source for something essential, you surrender flexibility. You don't set the price, you don't choose the infrastructure, you don't control the upgrade timeline, you participate, but you don't influence. For most people, this realization doesn't happen all at once. It builds slowly, a slightly higher bill here, a rate adjustment notice there, a warning about peak usage charges, a reminder about grid strain during extreme weather. Over time, the pattern becomes clear. Costs trend upward, control remains limited. The uncomfortable truth is that centralized systems prioritize scale and efficiency, not individual autonomy. They are designed to serve millions, not optimize for one household's financial stability. That doesn't make them evil, it makes them impersonal. And when something is impersonal, your needs are rarely the top priority. So this isn't about panic, it's about awareness. The energy landscape is shifting globally, and modern homes are more exposed than they realize. The combination of rising demand, infrastructure pressure, regulatory adjustments, and global volatility creates an environment where price increases feel less like anomalies and more like the new normal. At this point, the conversation shifts from "why is this happening?" to "what can I realistically do about it?" Because if the trajectory continues and current projections suggest rising long-term demand and investment, simply hoping for prices to drop back to previous levels may not be a strategy. It may be wishful thinking, and that's where a different mindset begins to emerge. Not necessarily going off-grid, not extreme measures, but thinking differently about how much control you actually have inside your own home. At this point, most people fall into one of two categories. They either accept the increases as inevitable and adjust their budget around them, or they start looking for ways to reduce consumption in small, incremental steps. They unplug devices, switch to LED bulbs, adjust thermostats, try to be more efficient. And while those habits are smart, they don't address the core issue. Efficiency reduces usage. It doesn't reduce dependency. The real shift happens when you stop seeing electricity as something that simply comes from the wall and start seeing it as a system you're connected to, a system with costs, vulnerabilities, and moving parts. Once you understand that, the conversation changes from passive consumption to active strategy, and strategy doesn't necessarily mean going fully off-grid or installing an expensive solar array tomorrow. For most homeowners, that's unrealistic. It requires high upfront investment, permits, contractors, and long-term commitments. That barrier alone stops many people from even exploring alternatives. But there is a middle ground that very few people talk about. Instead of asking, how do I escape the grid entirely? A more practical question might be, how can I reduce my reliance on it, even partially? Even a modest reduction in dependence can create psychological and financial relief. When you generate even a portion of your own power, you're not just saving money, you're shifting leverage. You're no longer 100% exposed to every rate hike. You're no longer completely vulnerable to every external disruption. You create a buffer, and buffers change behavior. They reduce anxiety. They create options. Think about it this way. When fuel prices rise, people with fuel-efficient vehicles feel the impact less. When grocery prices increase, those who grow even a small garden feel slightly more insulated. It's not about eliminating exposure completely. It's about reducing it enough to matter. Energy works the same way. The idea of producing some of your own electricity used to feel extreme. Today, it's becoming more practical and more accessible. Technology has evolved. Small-scale systems have become more feasible, and information that used to be restricted to engineers or specialists is now available to ordinary homeowners willing to learn. The key difference is mindset. Instead of seeing rising bills as something you endure, you start seeing them as a signal to reassess your level of dependence. Because when costs rise globally and structurally, waiting for them to reverse may not be realistic. But adjusting your exposure is. And that brings us to an important question. If there were a way to understand how alternative home energy systems actually work, in practical, step-by-step terms, would you at least want to explore it? If you've made it this far, it probably means you're not just casually curious. You're thinking. You're trying to understand whether rising energy costs are something you simply absorb, or something you can prepare for more intelligently. And here's the important distinction. This isn't about extreme solutions. It's not about disconnecting from society or installing a massive expensive system that costs tens of thousands of dollars. For most people, that's unrealistic and unnecessary. What many homeowners don't realize is that there are smaller, scalable approaches to generating supplemental power at home. Not to eliminate your bill overnight, not to replace the grid entirely, but to reduce exposure and create leverage. The biggest barrier isn't usually technology, it's clarity. Most people simply don't know where to start. What components are actually required? How much space is needed? What kind of output is realistic? What is marketing hype and what is technically sound? Without clear guidance, the idea of alternative energy feels overwhelming. That's why structured information matters. Recently, I came across a step-by-step system that breaks down how small-scale alternative energy setups can be built and understood at a practical level. It's not positioned as a miracle fix, and it doesn't promise to erase your electricity bill. What it does is explain, in accessible terms, how everyday homeowners can understand and potentially implement supplemental energy strategies without relying entirely on large contractors or complicated installations. It's called the Energy Revolution System, and what stood out to me is that it focuses on education and practical design principles rather than flashy promises. It walks through the concepts behind generating usable power at home using alternative methods, helping you evaluate what might make sense for your specific situation. Now, is it for everyone? No. If you're completely comfortable absorbing future rate increases and staying fully dependent on the centralized grid, you probably don't need it. But if you're the type of person who prefers having options instead of waiting for the next adjustment notice in the mail, then learning more could be worthwhile. Because knowledge shifts leverage. Even understanding how supplemental systems work changes the way you see your monthly bill. It turns frustration into strategy. It turns uncertainty into planning. If you're interested, I've placed a link in the comments where you can take a closer look and decide for yourself whether it aligns with what you're looking for. No pressure, just information. Explore it, evaluate it, and see if it makes sense for your situation. At the end of the day, rising energy costs are a global trend. That part may be outside your control, but how prepared you are for that trend, that part isn't. And sometimes, the difference between feeling trapped and feeling prepared starts with simply understanding your options.